Hi everyone. Today we're going to look at Zechariah 13:6. This is a prophecy supposedly about Jesus. This was Tovia Singer's claim in a video he released in July of 2022. And someone brought it to my attention, and then I've looked at it and I want to make a commentary on it. I've contacted Mr. Singer today, and he was very gracious, and he has granted me permission to use his video, a portion of it that I told him about. So he's not above allowing analysis of what he's saying, and I appreciate very much he agreed to that. Anyway, so this was the verse he was relying upon, and he is totally correct, by the way, that Christians have advocated in the past that this verse was about Jesus. And so he's not wrong of using that. So this is just going to show is that he can't be faulted that much when Christians were and scholars were claiming this verse was about Jesus. So that gives him an immediate pass. You'll see Dr. Pusey was one of the first to claim this is about Christians, and Tovia Singer says in two different places that evangelists, missionaries have come and told him about this passage applies to Jesus. But the Christians who are saying this don't read the context, and it means Jesus is a false prophet. So it's just that shows you we have to be, as Christians, we can't choose to use verses that are that we haven't ourselves tested thoroughly and made sure these are really prophetic about Jesus. Okay. Anyway, so what he was citing, and the Christian evangelists also cited at some time in the past, and currently he says this is going on still to this day. And one shall say to him, what are those wounds between your hands? Then he shall answer, those with which I was wounded in the house of my friends. Okay. And I'm going to go into this later, why that's important, but let's see what the context is. And just so everyone knows what Tovia Singer video I'm talking about, it's with this title, Shocker, Jewish Bible predicted Jesus was a false prophet, ? So he's asking the question. July 7, 2022. So let's look at this carefully. Okay, so Tovia Singer looked to the prior verse and he's saying, "Thank you, Mr. Missionary. You just made my job so easy. Look at 13:5. You're telling me your Jesus is 13:6. So what does 13:5 tell me about this person? Oh, he's a false prophet." But he will say, the same person who's in verse 6, I'm not a prophet, I'm a tiller of the ground, for a man sold me as a slave in my youth. So this has really been handed as a gift to Mr. Singer by these Christians who don't read anything they're doing. So in a sense, he's completely justified as long as we're making these claims ourselves. And so I just want to put that out there. Okay, so I want to just do an analysis of the verse, and there's actually two verses, 13:5 and 13:6, and there's several characteristics about this person who's the false prophet in context, and then see how many of these characteristics apply to Jesus, and then based on the conclusion from that, is it persuasive that this is really about Jesus? So the first characteristic is in Zechariah 13:5. It says, I am not a prophet, I'm a tiller of the ground. Jesus was not known as a tiller of the ground. It's not that he didn't ever do that, but it's not mentioned ever anywhere. And his father being a carpenter and him being a carpenter doesn't sound like they were people who had a lot of land. Maybe they had a small home, and that's why they were doing carpentry work rather than what would be farming work. So I would say that's a 0. Then the second part of 13:5 says he was, for a man sold me as a slave in my youth. There's nothing in the Gospels or even apocryphal Gospels that Jesus was sold as a slave in his youth. Nothing. Okay, then there's wound between your hands. That's Zechariah 13:6. If we go over to the right side there, the bottom, were there wounds between his hands? Let's just assume between your hands means in your hands. Now, it doesn't say that exactly, but that's one possible meaning. It could be in your hands, but it really could just be what it says, between your hands, which would be potentially what's between your hands, your chest or your back. So that could be another meaning, and that would be, so it's inconclusive, let's put it that way, but I'm going to give him that one. So we'll say between your hands could be basically pierced in your hands, but it doesn't use those words. But it's an argument, and it's an arguable. It's a rational deduction that it could mean that. It doesn't say that. And then it says, the last thing, it says, those with those, then he's going to be asked, what are these wounds between your hands? And he's going to answer and say, those with which I was wounded in the house of my friends. So then the wounds have to happen in the house of a friend. Well, basically he's wounded where Pilate and all those guys are, executing a death sentence on him, and it doesn't look to me like it's a house of friends very much. I mean, it's sort of absurd. So I don't think that applies. So you've got 4 factors in these 2 verses, one of which may apply. It's not clear. It doesn't say literally, it says between your hands. It doesn't literally say in your hands. So that would make me say it's 1 out of 4. And that's not truly persuasive that this is a prophecy about Jesus as a false prophet. And I want to also show you what the KJV did. It actually twisted the translation to be directly about Jesus. They wanted it to be about Jesus, as we'll see. So what did they do? One shall say unto him, the false prophet, but they've lost track of that, or they don't remember that. What are these wounds in your hands? So they're trying to translate it not between your hands, but wounds in your hands, to make it more about Jesus. Then he shall answer, those with which I was wounded in the house of my friends. Okay, so I just want to show you that Tovia Singer does not exploit this KJV mistranslation. He goes back to a more literal translation. You'll see he's being more fair than they deserve, the KJV people. So he has it back to between your hands, which is not as clear. Wounds in your hands is absolutely sounds like Jesus, and that's exactly what the KJV intended you to think, because they had not been tracking who is this about. This is about a false prophet. So they are trying to make this about Jesus, and so they change the translation from between your hands into wounds in your hands. So see the difference? And he doesn't exploit that, to his credit, because he knows it's not the literal meaning. Okay, and just as a comparison, the NIV has wounds on your body instead of on your hands, and I think that's probably not right to do. It is the word hands, and you should, if you want to say it's on the body, you should explain why between your hands would be maybe on the chest or the back. Okay, so they don't do that, and so to me it's left unclear. On the bottom left there, I have a list of how different translations translate it. 4 or 5 translated as the chest. The ESV translates it as the back. And then 4 are the arms, and 3 have hands. So it's technically hands, between the hands, but what it sounds like it means is it's between the hands, like your chest or your back, depending on which side we're looking at, where your hands are. So anyway, that's the NIV, and it's very unclear. You wouldn't say this is necessarily about Jesus. Many people get wounded in their body, in their chest, and their back, so it's not particularly surprising that this would happen to this particular false prophet. Okay, but fair play is also to now say, well, what does the Jewish Bible, that doesn't have any reason to bias this in Jesus' favor, what do they say? So here it is, the Israel Bible. And by the way, this is a Bible we should be looking at occasionally, just get a different flavor. Jewish Bible, very orthodox actually, and very rich in the way they translate things. Well, look at verse 6. And if he asked the false prophet, and if he asked, who's that? What are those sores on your back? He will reply. Well, anyway, I guess they're saying whoever this false prophet's in front of is. If he asks, what are those sores on your hands? No, on your back. And I do think there's reason to believe it's on your back or your chest, because if you think about what's between your hands, not in your hands, not wounds on your hands, it's between your hands. A way of saying that is, if you spread your hands out, what's between your hands? It's either your chest or your back. So this person has sores on his chest or back, which, by the way, that can also apply to Jesus, because he was wounded in both places. But what's much more distinctive about Jesus, obviously, is the holes in his palms from the nails. Okay, so I think what I just showed is that while Tovia Singer does claim that the word back is used in the NIV and some other translations rather than hands, he was saying that's due to the nervous point that this would otherwise be focusing on Jesus, and therefore he was contending it was an invalid translation because it was influenced by bias, which is still possible. But if you've got the Israel Bible already saying source on your back, it tends to make one think there could be an objective reason it isn't really hands. So let's see if we can figure that out. Okay, and lastly, before I showed you the video with Tovia Singer, is this supports his view that it's hands. This is the Jewish Publication Society of 1917, and basically it uses the word hands. However, I think again we're going to look into whether the word between is significant, because between your hands technically could be your chest or your back, and therefore we could get a different sense of what's the injury. And it doesn't say the wounds are in your palms or in your hands, so that kind of changes the picture. So now let's hear Mr. Singer out. I've given some thoughts that might be important to consider as he's saying what he's saying. So we're going to listen to what he has to say. This is about a 6-minute clip, 5 minutes and 40 seconds, but it's worth listening to.
Okay. There will be a false prophet who will come forward, and he's going to be deeply ashamed of his behavior. And he will say, I'm really no prophet. I really should have been someone who breeds animals and a tiller of the soil. See Zechariah 13, verse 1 through 6. And then people are going to come over to him and ask him this question. Mo hamakos ha'ela bein yodecha. What are those wounds between your hands? V'omar, he will reply, asher hukesi beis me'avai. Those are the wounds that I received in the house of my friends. Okay? So at the end is an end-time prophecy, and in the end, a false prophet who's obviously very prominent, who's very striking, and if you want to know something about him, he has wounds in his hands. And people will ask him, why are there wounds in your hands? And he will respond, I received them from my own people. Bingo. Here's even a greater shocker. There are missionaries who actually use this verse, Zechariah 13, verse 6, out of context to say, we have a prophecy about Jesus being crucified. I'm not kidding. I don't want to embarrass them, and I don't call out names, but there are major league missionaries who will put these kinds of passages, including Zechariah 13:6, in their missionary material, insisting that this proves that Jesus' crucified body will be revealed to the world at the end of days. And if you don't read that in context, you think, well, that sure looks like a crucifixion to me. Now, I want to say, because I don't want to mischaracterize all Christians. There are some responsible Christians in their commentary that warn Christians, do not think this is talking about Christ, because that's blasphemy. I'm not kidding. So strangely, you have a passage that's clearly talking about a false Messiah at the end of days, because we know at the end of days, there's going to be, as we see in Daniel chapter 12, verse 2, there are many who sleep in the earth, who will rise, some for everlasting life and others for everlasting contempt and damnation. Think about that for a moment. We have a passage in Daniel 12, very famous, that tells us that the truly wicked will be brought back temporarily. For what purpose? For contempt and damnation, meaning that people will see in their eyes, whoa, what a lie. What an evil person brought so many people astray. Okay? Because you might ask, at the end of days, there's someone who is going to confess that he was all along a false prophet, and people are going to ask him. It means he has to be around. Well, if he has to be around, how could that be a crucified Messiah who people thought was the Redeemer, who was not? It was a false Messiah. The answer is Daniel 12, verse 2. And that is that the very wicked will be brought back for contempt, that the world should see the truth. The most important thing, most important element, feature of the Messianic age is that the whole world will know the truth, and the knowledge of God will cover the world as the water covers the sea. Isaiah chapter 11, verse 9, similar passages to Habakkuk. It's everywhere. And interestingly, you're going to think this is nuts. But there are some Christian Bibles that actually seek to cover that by saying, what are those wounds on your back? Because the words in the text, the Hebrew is, Mohamakos elo ben yodecha, what are those wounds between your hands? Okay? Like if you speak sign language, you know what that means, right? But they don't want that in there, right? So they actually put on your back, because like what's between your hands? Your body, your torso. But what that does is it successfully, so if using the ESV, right, it then masks what it says. To what percentage do I assign that passage to the likelihood of being Jesus? I can't think of anyone else in history who was a false prophet, who people believed spoke in the name of the Lord. That was not. And the key, most important feature of this individual is that he had wounds between his hands. Could you? So I can't think of anyone else. And I encourage you to look at Zechariah 13:6 and just look at the nervousness of the translators and commentators on this.
Okay, so the first thing I just want to point out is that he is kind of molding the argument as well as he's going here. The verse 13:5 says this false prophet will say, "I am a tiller of the ground," and his characterization of what could be the fulfillment here in the case of Jesus is he would have said, "I really should have been a tiller of the soil." So I think actually Mr. Singer is implicitly acknowledging that Jesus doesn't actually, he's never described as a tiller of the soil. Now that doesn't mean he didn't do it either. You know, he could have, it's a farm. He was on a farm apparently, and he was, or in those days, everybody I think did farming, maybe you could argue. But anyway, it's just, we have to be strict, is we don't have any knowledge that Jesus was a tiller of the ground, and it can't be conjectured into this passage by imagining he said something like, you know, I really should have been a tiller soil. So let's keep it factual to the verse and then see if we have any real connections between this verse and Jesus. Okay, and now, so I decided let's look at BibleHub.com and see what we can get. What are the original words here? So it's ben, between, yadeka, your arms. Now that doesn't say your hands, does it? So I don't know why. But when you go to Exodus 15:17, so I decided, let me look fairly. Okay, so 17 of 18 times all prior uses translated hands. So for some reason, Bible Hub, so I'm going to show a little bias here. Why would they say in 17 of the 18 other times of verses where this word yadeka is meant, it's always translated hands. So I showed you one example. Exodus 15:17, which your hands have established, Lord, you have established your hands. So I think there's maybe a little game playing here. So that would make me suspicious, is why would you, for just this verse, out of all the 18 times, you change it to your arms. So that goes in favor of Mr. Tovia Singer's argument that there's some bias in the Christians who are trying to manipulate the definition and get it away from hands and make it arms, which is very selective. Here's 1 out of 18 times that it's used to be arms, but every other, 17 of 18 times it's hands. So yeah, so now you have a little bit of game playing with on the Christian Bible side. Okay, so now I want to get into commentary. Enduring Word is a fairly decent commentary, and so they're going to acknowledge what Mr. Singer had said also, is that these evangelicals, these missionaries, come at him and tell him this verse applies to Jesus. And he's like, great, you've given me this great fodder that I can use against Jesus. And so these missionaries just handed him, this win right there. So as Christians, we need to be sensible. Look at what look at the context. This is a notorious problem with whom, if you go to my website, you will learn there's a pattern and practice of people who are who just pull a verse out of context, and it ends up in context. It means the opposite of what they want it to be. And this is the greatest blunder you can make. And with someone as Mr. Tovia Singer, who's as smart as he is, he's going to be able to weaponize that on you. So you can't come into a meeting with him and try to bring something up that you haven't studied. So let's listen to what you should have known. I was wounded in the house of my friend. Some take this as another messianic prophecy in Zechariah, because Jesus was clearly wounded by those who should have been his friends. Okay, but it doesn't say it's the house of his, it says the verses, it was in the house of my friends, not should have been my friends. Okay, so now you've already, somebody's trying to stretch it. Nevertheless, the context in the original Hebrew argue against this referring to Jesus and his wounds. Why is that? So then it goes into subpart I. The translation from the King James Version makes it seem that this refers to Jesus. What are these wounds in thine hands? Now this is kind of misleading. It's trying to say the word hands, well, actually, no, he's right. If the King James says in thine hands, now that's different, isn't it? So that would make it be the palms of your hand. But the other ones, even the Jewish Publication Society says between your hands. So you see the King James Version, what he's saying, pushed it a little closer to Jesus. They're trying to make it come out, so they put in the word in thine hands. So this probably goes to the very point that Mr. Singer's doing, is that the Christian evangelists are using this because the King James reads exactly like it's in his hands, not between his hands. And to his credit, Mr. Singer is actually using a different verse in the King James. He said between your hands, which is more apparently honest. So he's being more fair to us than we deserve, because our own King James said in your hands. In his, the false prophets talked about what are those wounds in your hands. So you see, the King James Bible was trying to bend towards Jesus, but they were hurting Jesus because this is about a false prophet. It's like they're not reading the context. Okay, next. But the Hebrew is more literally between your hands. So now this person's saying, aha. But the King James has it wrong, and the more literal meaning is that. And to Mr. Singer's credit, he went with the more literal meaning. He didn't go and take advantage of the King James blunder. Okay, but this is what happens with what? Biased translations. You were trying to make this to be about Jesus. The King James did, so they biased it, and they foolishly biased it incorrectly to point to him as a false prophet, because they're not reading the context of their own Bible. Okay, and then during a word, we'll talk about some relevant responses. I kind of find this funny. Some apply this to Christ, meaning this passage. This is about a false prophet, right? Because Zechariah has mentioned wounds on thy hands. Actually, the King James said in your hands. But this is very puerile. Oh, this is John Calvin. This is a quote of John Calvin. So he likes to use words like that. Like, you're very childish to do this. It's all you have to do is, John Calvin, all you need to do is say it's wrong. You don't have to call him a child. For it is quite evident that he speaks here of false teachers who had for a time falsely pretended God's name. So Calvin's saying, you are wrong, and did you not read the context? This is about false teachers, false prophets. So why are you trying to bend and twist this to be about Jesus? Good question. And again, you end up with Tovia Singer hanging a completely legitimate ground to cite this back at us, because our own Bibles were skewed to make it look like it was about Jesus. Oh. Anyway, then Clark is another commentator. I do not think that these words are spoken at all concerning Jesus Christ. I have heard them quoted this way, but I cannot hear such an application of them without horror. Yes, that's what it is. It's horrible. Why would you have twisted this passage into to be about Jesus? But I want to say something. This is completely aside from this debate. Why are Christian translators twisting and turning Scripture to a certain direction where they're not allowed to do that? Translation is a sacred task. You do not add interpretation into text. You do not try to point it in any one direction. You try to do a literal translation. The literal translation was between your hands. But you know what? If I were Tovia Singer, I'm going to go, why would I ever read the King James Bible? These people were willing to mistranslate and force this text to be about Jesus. So the one thing he's going to pull away from this, if I were him, you've all proven yourselves frauds because you're willing to change a verse to be about Jesus when you didn't look at the context and you made it be about him as a false prophet. You didn't know what you were doing, but you're willing to basically misrepresent Scripture and what it meant. You didn't say between, which is more literal, and I, Mr. Singer, I even pulled back and I used between, but you guys said it was a wound in his hands because you wanted this to be about Jesus. But here's John Calvin and here's Mr. Clark telling you it's a horrible reading. It's a puerile, childish reading. You've been destructive of your own Savior by doing these things, and it just makes you look like a laughingstock, but it also makes our Bible translators look like liars. Liars. And that is a problem because we do have Bible translators, and there are nameless people. We don't know who they were in the King James team. Who was the one who did this? Who was the one who was willing to lie of what was in Scripture because he thought it would be helpful? Ay. Okay, let's keep going. All right, so now we're going to see this. There's a history of this of a viewpoint within Christianity trying to argue this passage is about Jesus, and they didn't read the context. And there was a guy named Dr. Pusey, the reference which Dr. Pusey and others have seen in this verse to our Lord and to the prints of the nails in his hand is in a high degree forced and arbitrary. Well, it is, because why? Those words, wounds in the hands, isn't in the hands. It's between the hands, which is potentially very significant. It cannot possibly be reconciled with the preceding context. And what he means, it's about a false prophet. So how can you reconcile this to be about Jesus? If you love Jesus and you don't want him to be falsely accused, you wouldn't concede to an enemy. So this is like going into a defense trial. Imagine Tovia Singer is the other side in a trial, and he's the attorney for the prosecution of Jesus. Okay, I'm just going to show you at the end of time. And that's what he's saying. This is a judgment court at the end of time. And he's going to be able to get up and say, but Your Honor, these Christians, Dr. Pusey, the translator of the King James, they all conceded this was about Jesus and he was a false prophet. So why can I be faulted for saying he's a false prophet when the King James made him into a false prophet, when Dr. Pusey turned him into a false prophet? Calvin conceded that that's what these people were doing. Clark admitted that's what they were doing, and it was with horror he reads that. Do you see the point? What would God do when Tovia Singer gets up and says in the final court hearing, you know what? These are not theoretical. God's going to have a court of judgment, and maybe he's going to bring in people like Tovia Singer to have his day with you guys and embarrass you for lying and cheating and changing the verse to be about Jesus, not unwittingly destroying the validity of Jesus in the minds of Mr. Tovia Singer, and with justification because you twisted the verse. But in fairness to him, he didn't. He put in the literal meaning. When he put it on his little slide, he put it in between the hands, and then he read that could be the marks on the hands. It could be. It still could be. But it's more ambiguous. But saying it was wounds in the hands as the KJV had it, well, now you sealed the deal for Jesus to be the prophet in this passage and didn't read that he's a false prophet. So this is I hope you get the sense that these are mistakes that reveal your hearts. The King James editors are willing to lie and cheat. Lie and cheat about a verse and add and change the meaning to try to make it look like a prophecy about Jesus, unwittingly destroying the validity of Jesus. There you go. And he's going to have a prosecution at the end of time, if this is the way God's going to handle it, where he could put these people in a box. And then what do you think God's going to do with these people who lied in the Bible and made Jesus look like a false prophet and made Jewish people look at him, hey, these people are themselves conceding he's a false prophet. They're not reading the context, I don't think, but they themselves are handing me a golden egg here. I think it's going to be a dark day for a lot of people who translated the Bible, because that's a sacred task. There's no reason ever to bias the text to try to make something there that isn't there. And that's what they did. They committed a theological crime. All right, that's my speech. Let's see what else we got. Okay, so I guess we reached the end. So it just basically, this is Calvin's. The next final quote was Calvin's going to say that it cannot be reconciled with the verse to which it intimately coheres. In other words, if you know Jesus is a true prophet, this cannot be a verse that's about Jesus. However, I'm just going to say it one last time. It was mistranslated to make it be about Jesus, and you there's an old expression, you're going to be hoisted by your own petard. And so I hope indeed that God will take the people who made these erroneous translations and put them in the dock and tell them how many thousands of people didn't come to Christ because they changed the words to be about Jesus Christ. Because every soul is, I believe that not following Jesus and disobeying him is, if he's the prophet, which I believe Mr. Tovia Singer does not. That's a whole other can of worms. But as to those people who had an opportunity to accept Jesus as the prophet of Deuteronomy 18, as Peter said in Acts 3, verses 22 and 23, this prophecy was every word this prophet speaks, you must listen to and obey. He's like a king. He doesn't need to quote Yahweh every time he's talking. He just has to be the king. He has to be the prophet. Where God says to Moses that every word he says, I'll hold all men accountable to obey. And that's what I think happens. Okay? But you, who translated this wrongly, you gave people grounds to believe he was a false prophet, the way you translated this and didn't look at the context. So I think that all the souls that didn't come to Christ because of your mistranslation, it's on your dime. And I wonder if God's going to give an excuse to all the people who didn't come to Christ because you mistranslated this verse. That may be what God does. Maybe he does something fair because these people were misled. And I pray to God there's some redemption that people will get when we look at all the other lies you put into our New Testament with all these mistranslations about pisto in Greek, pisto eis, and all the things we expose here at our website, at our channel. So anyway, I hope we can see that translation is a sacred duty, and those mistranslations that we expose on this channel, we pray that when the translators listen to what we have here, they would realize the consequences of just even the smallest word, the word between the hands and in the hands. In the hands. What a small difference, but a big, huge difference. Trying to skew the text. And in the hands was materially different than between the hands. And that's what the KJV did. They crossed that line and made it in the hands, according to the commentaries. Okay, everyone, I hope this will help us to realize that this passage we don't have to worry about. But I do appreciate Tovia Singer letting me go through and criticize what he said, and that means he's a bigger man than most of our translators have no willingness to debate any of these things. They'll just accuse us of being false prophets or false teachers. That's what they'll say, but they won't ever fess up that they've made a mistake. And this is a big blunder. Okay, God bless everyone. Take care. Ciao. Bye.